So today we're going to have a short series on job site theft. Now this is an unfortunate circumstance that we find ourselves in as builders, and that's throughout the country. There's only so much you can do to stop people, or in this case criminals. During the course of construction, during any custom home build, it's going to take over the course of 9 months to 18 months, and ultimately you're going to have a lot of trade partners coming and going throughout the job site. And while we hope / cross our fingers that none of our trade partners or our employees ever steal anything from our site, so a lot of people might think, well, what is there to steal on a job site? And they're right. Ultimately, there's usually not a lot of things that are worth money at any given stage of the project. But as we've found, we've had issues with materials being stolen by other contractors, such as lumber or rough materials. So let's talk about the project from inception to completion and at different points when you're most at risk. So the first is going to be an empty job site where you just have rough materials. The second is going to be during our rough out phase, which is usually going to include a fair amount of copper wiring, so on and so forth. And I think a lot of people understand that that's something that's been a problem throughout the years of people coming and trying to salvage or pull out all your copper wire to recycle. The third item is going to be during trim out. Ultimately at that point, I feel like is when the house is actually secure enough, which we'll talk about in a few seconds, but ultimately this is going to put your finished material at risk, whether that be your tile, which usually never gets stolen, your doors, your hardware, your toilets, or anything that you're storing on site during this portion of the job. And the last is going to be at final, when the house is vacant. And this is when it's most problematic because you have your most expensive things in here, including all your hardware, but specifically your appliances, which has become problematic, especially with the lead times that have been created by the supply chain issues out there. So let's talk about how rebuild a block and how you, as a contractor, should protect your job site. So the first line of defense, which we no longer have here at our Catalina project, would be our chain link fence. Now ultimately these things are going to be chained and locked, and they're really just deterring people to be able to just come directly on the job site. But let's be honest, they're only 6 feet tall, and ultimately, as I mentioned before, lots of people have our codes. But it's usually sufficient enough to make sure that trucks don't pull up on this job site and take raw materials off during the first few months at the start of the build. Second line of defense is typically going to be put in place during our roughing phase. Now that's going to be our windows and door packages. Typically we sheathe the whole house, and so this allows us to be able to have a more secure job site than some other builders. But really the main systems are still at risk unless those doors are able to lock and secure. If not, and we don't have windows on site, which has been a problem as of late, given the supply chain issues with waiting for certain window manufacturers, sometimes up to 24 weeks, we still have to secure all of the openings throughout the home. And we typically do this with an OSB or a plywood. A lot of this is sometimes left over from the sheathing detail that we typically have around the house. So our third line of defense is actually going to be our trade partner base. They're the ones that are on site a majority of the time, especially towards the end of the day. So it's important for them to adhere to the rules that we've set up, which is the last person out needs to make sure that the job site's secure. Now, while this doesn't always happen, it's best to have good relationships with your trade partners to ensure the least amount of nighttime activity that might occur on the lot. The fourth is going to be our internal team. Now, our internal team is responsible day in and day out for their own projects. So our on-site construction manager is responsible for coming in at the end of the day and making sure that everything's locked up. But it goes a lot quicker if our trade partners accomplish that task that we just discussed. The fifth, and one of the most important and crucial pieces of the puzzle, is going to be our neighbors. Now, we've talked about neighbors and some of the nuances of dealing with neighbors, such as building block walls, shared block walls that is, but really just being a good steward of the neighborhood. By going and meeting our neighbors, we can have them keep an eye out for our lots, especially after the hours of 5 p.m. in the evening to about 6 in the morning. And we have had neighbors that have reached out to us to be able to tell us of suspicious activity that might revolve around our job sites. Now, for a lot of our specs, we've been told over and over again that if we want to avoid any theft or criminal activity on our job sites, to have video cameras put in place. But what we found is that there's not been a true cost-effective solution for this, specifically on spec. Now, when you're dealing with a luxury residence where there's a client that really wants to pay for that top level notch of security, then it becomes an option. But if you can imagine having 6 to 10 active job sites at any given time at a cost of roughly somewhere between $1,000 and $1,200 a month per job site, it gets cost exorbitant, and ultimately isn't really a solution that we found that will allow us to be able to bring it into the fold. But the second item with cameras is we typically don't have internet access. They usually have to be battery powered, which means that we're swapping those out and to make sure that they are run appropriately throughout the course of construction. But the third is whenever we've had a claim for any theft that's occurred, and we have had video footage from, let's say, a neighbor's video camera, it really doesn't hold up in the court of law from a standpoint that they're usually not very clear, they're not concise of what actually happened, and it also takes us a really long time to be able to get any law enforcement out here for a nonviolent activity that might take place on our job site. And so ultimately, this has just not been a cost-effective strategy. But I would like to move on to one of the key things, especially towards the end of the project, that allows us to be able to keep our job sites secure, and that's utilizing great products. Let's go take a peek at one of the products that stop theft from occurring here at Catalina. So over the past couple years, we've used Air Pacific predominantly with most of our builds. And one of the things that a lot of door manufacturers have been developing is secure entryways. And the way that they do that is with a 3 or 5 point locking system that you'll notice in this door set. Ultimately, once this door is engaged, there's a pin that drops to the floor and there's a pin that drops into the casement above us, as well as a deadbolt that latches through that impedes those latches from becoming disengaged. Now, in the past, we've talked to our clients a lot about these types of doors and just how strong they are. And while it's an unfortunate circumstance, we did have a fair amount of Kohler and other fixtures and finishes as we're starting to punch this house out. And we did notice, and when I say we, I mean my trade partner, Jayden over at Canyon State Carpentry, had noticed one day that when he tried to access the door, someone had actually tried to break into the home, most likely to steal some of the materials inside. Fortunately for us, and unfortunately for them, they decided to come through one of the most secure entryways that we have into the house. And while they did do some minor damage by wrenching on this door with a crowbar, ultimately they were unable to get into the house, which allowed us to be able to save a fair amount of money with a few of the things that they might have taken from inside. So one of the last deterrents that I want to talk about is trying to hide some of the things that are residing in the home. So in this teen room, which doesn't have a lot of viewpoints from any specific window, has our Kohler toilets as well as a very heavy tub that will be positioned in the primary closet. So what I find most interesting is that if someone actually was able to come in and get into the home, they would have to carry some very heavy items away with them, which obviously is one of the reasons that we want to talk to our neighbors, because that usually takes time. We're really grateful for the amazing neighborhoods that we develop in here in the Arcadia and Paradise Valley areas. Usually the neighbors are on top of it and they really help to keep our job sites as secure as possible. Thanks for following along. I hope that you guys never have any issues with security on your job sites, but if you take some minor precautions, you get to know your neighbors and you get to know your team, making sure that they take care of all these items. I think that you're going to be able to minimize a lot of the losses that might occur in the future. Click the button below to subscribe or like us on any of our social media channels. Have a great day.